Hello, my name is Sharon Peterson, and I'm one of the dietitians with the Villages Health. Today, I'd like to share a topic with you called nutrition in the news. So our objectives for this session are to discuss the differences between nutrition research and nutrition-related news stories. Let's review some tips for analyzing nutrition-related news. And then I'd like to highlight a couple of recent studies that are worth our attention. So nutrition research versus nutrition in the news. Is there a difference? Well, I think most of us would agree that the two groups have potentially different motives. Research is slow and plodding, while news is fast-paced and ever-changing. Perhaps there's different levels and types of training. Researchers have a tendency to interpret results and talk about statistical methods and recognize bias and discuss limitations, while reporters are faced with quick deadlines and often rely on news releases and/or abstracts of the study for their reports. So I wanted to share with you an example of a technique that is quite common, and it's called making negative results sound positive. There were actually a group of researchers that collected 70 randomized controlled trials that ended up being translated into news stories. And then they went back to the original stories and compared the news releases to the original studies. So positive spin was found in 40% of the journal article abstracts itself. So the abstract of the journal article had spin in it. And then 47% of the news releases about that research study were found to have positive spin. This is the citation for that research study that I'm referring to. So here's a specific example from an original study that demonstrates this technique. So the actual results in the original research journal article said, we found no statistically significant differences between acupuncture and a certain medication they were comparing it to. No differences on hot flashes in breast cancer patients. So the original study was a head-to-head comparison comparing acupuncture to the medication. No statistically significant differences on hot flashes. When it got to the abstract of that original journal article, they had actually kind of switched their study design to a pre-post study design, and the conclusions in that abstract said both groups exhibited significant decreases in hot flashes from pre to post treatment. Okay, so now the results in the news release actually stated acupuncture reduces hot flashes for breast cancer patients. So it is not lying, but I think it certainly demonstrates how non-results can become positive headlines. So here are some questions to ask when we are analyzing nutrition news. So what was the source? Did they give us any idea of, was this an actual research study? Was it an abstract? Was it an editorial? Was it a consensus report from health organizations? Maybe a systematic review, maybe a meta-analysis. Now, each of these have different strengths. For example, the editorial would be the weakest source in this list because it is one person's opinion. It is an expert opinion, but it is one person's opinion about a topic. A consensus report from health organizations is pretty strong, actually, because to get a number of different health organizations to agree on something gives us, some confidence that this is likely to be a good source. A systematic review is where researchers gather up very similar articles, and they have a certain way of, determining the similarities of the articles. And then they look for generalizable statements or similarities or ways of saying, based on these 17 studies, this is what we understand the outcomes to be. Similarly, a meta-analysis also gathers up similar articles, but in this case, they actually reanalyzed the original data. So the sample size might go from 200 in the original study to now that we have these 17 studies that we're going back in and reanalyzing the data for, now we might have a sample size of a couple thousand. So that actually is a pretty strong one too. The actual research study is strong. The abstract, as we've already demonstrated, might have a little bit of spin in it. So different strengths from the different sources. Also ask ourselves, what was the population? Was it the study on humans? Was it on animals? Was it on cells? For example, a study that was done on young overweight males with diabetes may not be incredibly relevant to me. That's probably a study I personally wouldn't pay attention to. And what was the type of study? Now, you hear about observational or cross-sectional studies. They are valuable, they are important, but they are based on taking a snapshot of what's going on at that point in time. They're observing behaviors or collecting, survey information. So really, with observational and cross-sectional studies, we can only talk about associations. Compared to a randomized controlled trial, which is a much stronger study design, which can actually show cause and effect. Because a randomized controlled trial is where they might have two groups, might have more than two groups, but the two groups, and they actually do an intervention. And sometimes they even trade the groups over and have each group do both interventions. Just depends on how they set it up. But randomized controlled trials actually have the strength to be able to make statements of cause and effect. Some more questions. What about the methods? Do we have any clue to how they collected the dietary intake data, for example? Was it self-reported? Was it measured? Did they take photos of the plates before and after? Did they measure before and after? Was the study long enough to be effective? I might eat a certain way for 2 or 3 days, but is that the way I eat for 6 months? Maybe, maybe not. And did they follow up with the participants later and see how they were doing, see if they, if they were still doing those behaviors that they had observed 6 months ago? All of those would, if the study's long enough and if they follow up, that would strengthen the methods for sure. What about the results? We should ask, how were these outcomes determined? Did they measure labs? Did they look at risk factor reduction? Was it self-reported changes, which, are not as strong? And interestingly, was it statistically significant? And was it clinically significant? So statistically significant means mathematically, if we did the same study 100 times, 95 out of 100 times, the results would come out the same. So that means it's statistically significant. It's likely not to have happened by chance. Clinically significant means this is the so what. Does it really matter in the big scheme of things? So a classic example would be a result that stated that the participants had a 3-fold increase in weight loss. Okay, so it actually was statistically significant, but the actual weight loss was 3 pounds versus 1 pound. And we might argue that that's not really clinically significant. Most people would be looking for more weight loss than that. So we know that no single study is perfect or totally conclusive. That's why we have these things called systematic reviews, where researchers can go in and evaluate many studies that are similar to determine some overall conclusions. So here are some studies that are worth our attention. You may have heard of the DASH studies. DASH stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, DASH. The effort actually started in 1997 as observational studies, where the researchers noticed groups of people that had very little hypertension or high blood pressure, and they had very little rise in high blood pressure with age. Now that's very different than what we see in this country. So they were very curious to see what was going on and what allowed these people to not have their blood pressure go up as they aged and to not have very high rates of high blood pressure. So they observed that these groups ate lots of fruits and vegetables. They ate low-fat dairy instead of high-fat dairy. They ate less beef and pork and proportionately more fish and chicken. And they ate less butter and more oils. So that was the observational study where they looked at what these people were doing and looked for associations, right? The original DASH study. So the scientists at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute decided that the next step would be to do a clinical trial to see if the DASH dietary pattern would actually lower blood pressure. Was this the factor? Was this eating style the factor that was supporting their low blood pressure, or was it something else? So the first round of DASH studies pitted the standard American diet, which we like to call SAD, against the standard American diet with a few extra fruits and vegetables added, and those fruits and vegetables replaced some of the snacks and sweets in the standard American diet. And then the third level was the full-blown DASH diet, which is defined as very high intake of fruits and vegetables, emphasizes low-fat dairy, and has less saturated fat and less added sugars than the standard American diet. So those are the three levels of intervention diets that they used in the first DASH study. So let's look at the results. After, and I said only 8 weeks, which is not very long, the fruit and vegetables group had lowered their blood pressure significantly. So the middle group had lowered their blood pressure significantly when compared to the standard American diet. But the DASH diet had lowered blood pressure even more. And the amount it was lowered was equivalent to taking blood pressure medication. So this was really a big deal and really an interesting result at the time, and very exciting for those of us that are, looking at prevention and looking at using food as medicine. So that same group of researchers got excited and said, okay, now let's see what happens if we lower the sodium content of the DASH diet versus the standard American diet. So in the first round, they hadn't done anything with the sodium level. So this second round, they changed the sodium content. And so the second study was called DASH sodium. So the results of the second study, the DASH sodium study, here's kind of what it looked like. They had 412 people assigned to the DASH diet or the standard American diet with 3 different sodium levels. So they had a 3,300 milligram sodium, which is kind of similar to the typical American diet. It's actually probably a little bit lower than what the standard American diet sodium content is, versus 2,400 milligrams, which is a level that we aim for when even lower than that, but 2,400 for if we have blood pressure or kidney issues. And then 1,500 milligrams is a really tight sodium restriction. It's very tough. And basically to get to 1,500 milligrams, a person has to not eat at restaurants and not have anything canned, no convenience food. So very tight sodium level. So this is what it looked like. There was DASH at the 3 sodium levels, and there was standard American diet at the 3 sodium levels. So these 412 people were split up and into each of these 6 groups. Results showed that the blood pressure reduction just from cutting salt was substantial. So we're talking about the 3 levels in the standard American diet. Even with the standard American diet, but cutting the sodium, the blood pressure was significantly reduced, and especially in older adults. And that the difference for DASH low sodium group was even better. Now it was even better than blood pressure medications. The top number actually decreased by 8 points. So as you can imagine, the researchers were continuing to be very excited with the results of these studies. So the third DASH diet study wanted to look at what would happen. The scientists now said, what would happen if we reduce the carbs in the original DASH eating pattern and replace the carbs with unsaturated fats and plant-based proteins like nuts and legumes? So as time was marching on, this point in time was when we were looking at pulling back on the carbs. And so then the next round of the DASH diet study group was called OmniHeart. So as you may have guessed, the results of replacing some of the carbs with protein and unsaturated fats not only lowered blood pressure, also lowered blood cholesterol and triglycerides, even more than the original DASH diet. Remember, the original DASH diet was already high in fruits and vegetables and had lower fat dairy, and we've already talked about that. So OmniHeart, pulling back on the carbs, did even better than the original DASH diet, which was the one that was set up to originally be compared with the standard American diet. So very exciting results, and I wanted to show you what the characteristics of the OmniHeart diet would look like. Let's see how closely we match up to this. So again, high intake of vegetables and fruits, the equivalent of about 3 cups of vegetables and 2.5 cups of fruits per day. Whole grain, bread, cereals, rice, and pasta. If we're going to have bread, cereal, rice, or pasta, it needs to be whole grain. And OmniHeart diet has up to 4 half-cup servings per day of that. Protein foods, your legumes, your nuts and seeds, your poultry, fish, eggs, lean meats, 5 servings a day, and very much, very important to avoid processed meats like the bacon, sausage, hot dogs, ham, salami, bologna, pepperoni, and bratwurst. These high salt, high fat processed meats are now directly linked to colon cancer. Another characteristic of OmniHeart diet is fats and oils. 4 tablespoons per day was the limit, and this would include things like olive oil, salad dressing, other vegetable oils, mayonnaise. Sweets and added sugars, your honey, jelly, syrup, up to 2 teaspoons or 8 grams, no more than 8 grams of added sugar per day. And the daily sodium goal of less than 2,300 milligrams for OmniHeart diet, which would really mean we would need to limit our soups, our salty snacks, our canned items, and our restaurant meals to be able to get to that level. So that's the story about the DASH diet trials and OmniHeart, and a very well-established research program that again started in 1997. I wanted to call your attention to a more current study that is just getting started, but I think is going to be as significant. So here's another study that deserves our attention. Kevin Hall and his research team at the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases, that team is studying the role of ultra-processed foods in the U.S. obesity epidemic. So it's very interesting to try to figure out how they're going to go about doing this. Their research question is, will people eat more calories when eating a diet composed of ultra-processed foods versus unprocessed foods with the same amount of sugar, carbs, fat, and salt? So it might not sound like that big of a deal, but if you sit and think about it for a second, how are you going to control for sugar, carbs, fat, and salt in unprocessed foods and have the same amount of those items in ultra-processed versus unprocessed foods? So let's talk about this a little bit. So their definition of ultra-processed foods, this is what they included, and they used a definition that was already kind of in the research. They have already identified some potential problems with this definition, and they're already adjusting it for their next round of studies. But for the results I'm going to present today, their definition of ultra-processed foods was regular sodas and sugary fruit drinks, chips and salty snacks, ice cream, chocolate, packaged breads, cookies, pastries, cakes, breakfast cereals, cereal bars, flavored yogurts, frozen pizza, fish sticks, sausage, hot dogs, chicken nuggets, and instant soups. So we can probably point at some of those items and say, I would not consider flavored yogurt an ultra processed food. Or how can they include all breakfast cereals as ultra processed foods? So those are some of the sticky spots that they're trying to work out for their next round of studies. Here's how they defined unprocessed foods: fresh or frozen vegetables, beans and legumes, fruits, nuts, seeds, poultry, fish and seafood, meats, eggs, low-fat milk, unflavored yogurt, oats, and whole grain pasta, cereals, and rice. Again, we might be able to poke some holes in that definition. Personally, I don't like using the word meats because I think when they say meat, they really mean beef and pork. Maybe they mean lean beef and pork. I'm not sure. It's not clear. So again, they're working out those kinks. But for our purposes today, let's just think about one group eating goldfish crackers, baked chips, and peanut butter crackers, while the other group is eating things like apples, oranges, and almonds. So the question is, are ultra-processed foods making us fat? So in this study, 20 people lived at the facility for a month, and they were provided twice as much food as they needed and were told to eat as much or as little as they wanted. They were provided 3 meals plus snacks and bottled water. So these folks lived at the facility and had free access to however, they had available to them way more food than they actually, needed. The methods included measuring every bite they ate. And remember, it was controlled for sugar, carbs, fat, protein, and fiber. Each group did 2 weeks on each diet. So 2 weeks on the ultra processed, 2 weeks on the unprocessed. Same people. The results: people ate an average of 500 more calories per day on the ultra processed diet versus unprocessed diet. So think about junk foods versus whole foods. The ultra processed group, when they were eating the ultra processed foods, gained 2 pounds in 2 weeks, and the unprocessed group lost 2 pounds in 2 weeks. Remember that both of these diets had equal amounts of the nutrients that are being blamed for the obesity epidemic: sugar, carbs, and fat. So these results are pretty amazing. So where did the extra calories come from? The answer is the participants ate more carbs and fats, not more protein. This actually mirrors the changes in the American diet since 1970. The average US adult is now eating 250 to 300 more calories per day, and almost all of those excess calories are coming from fats and carbs. You might ask, did the unprocessed foods or the healthy whole foods curb their appetite? Maybe that's why they didn't eat as much. The answer is maybe. There is a hormone, PYY, that suppresses appetite, and they did measure that, and PYY was significantly higher on the unprocessed or whole food healthy diet. However, participants also ate slower on the unprocessed healthy whole food diet. They had to chew more, perhaps, and so they ate 30 calories per minute versus 50 calories per minute on the ultra processed. And as I kind of alluded to, ultra processed junk foods are typically softer and easier to chew and swallow. So maybe the participants just ate more before that PYY hormone kicked in. You might ask, what about the fiber? How did they control for fiber? Well, in the unprocessed healthy whole foods, the fiber was naturally in the foods, right? But it was added to the ultra processed diet through the diet lemonade. So it was an added fiber, like a liquid fiber. What about added sugars versus natural sugars? Well, unprocessed had virtually no added sugar, okay? While about 50% of the sugar in the ultra processed or junk food diet was added sugar. So yes, the fiber was different in the two types of diets, and the added sugars versus natural sugars was different in the two types of diets. So are ultra processed foods making us fat? All I can say is, stay tuned. They're going to be doing more research out of this group. And I'm suggesting that if we take a step back and look at all of today's diets, whether it's keto, paleo, plant-based, Mediterranean, DASH, Omnihart, vegan, whatever, if you think about it, all of these diets have one thing in common. They all limit or eliminate ultra-processed foods. So I would say that that is a very important message for us to think about. Is step one is really to get serious about limiting and or eliminating the ultra-processed junk foods and sugary beverages that are potentially still in our eating style. So how can I find resources about understanding nutrition in the news? One of my favorite resources, here's some examples of headlines. Half-baked news bites, seeing through the news, headline headaches, are you getting the full story? Unexpected, 5 recent things that may surprise you, how news can confuse. These are all examples that I use to help stay caught up on what's going on, and they are all headlines from Nutrition Action Health Letter. This is published 10 times a year by the Center for Science and Public Interest. CSPI is a Washington-based nonprofit watchdog and consumer advocacy group that advocates for safer and healthier foods. I've been subscribing to Nutrition Action Health Letter for years. It's the best $24 I can spend. This group takes no donations from government or corporations, and they accept no advertising. And so it would be my #1 recommendation. And there's your website if you want to look into it. There's also a week with the DASH eating plan can be found at NIH's National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute website, which is listed here. Thank you for your time today, and I would love to hear from you if you have any questions or comments.